Nobody on Meadow Ridge Road in Winterset, Iowa, knew what to make of the black car. It rolled down the street on a cold November morning in 1971 and stopped in front of Earl Sutton's house like it belonged there. Long, dark, completely wrong for this part of town. Earl was sitting on his porch in his cardigan and suspenders, the way he did every morning that the cold permitted. He had his coffee. He had his radio. He had the particular silence of a man who had learned to live inside very small days. He did not move when the car stopped. He watched the driver's door open. He watched a man unfold himself from the seat. 6'4", 220 pounds, a jaw like a courthouse wall, and a face that half the country had been watching on movie screens since before the war. The man stood on the sidewalk in a plain jacket and dark trousers, holding something in one hand, a piece of paper, folded, worn at the creases the way paper gets when someone has opened and closed it too many times. For a moment, no one moved. Earl's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. The man on the sidewalk looked up at the house the way a person looks at something they have been picturing for a long time. Then he began walking up the path. But that moment didn't start there. John Wayne stepped up onto that porch and stopped at the top step. He looked down at Earl Sutton, this small, white-haired veteran with a slight tremor in his left hand, and 14 years of silence stored behind his eyes. And he said 4 words in that voice America knew better than its own anthem. "I owe you, Earl." Earl grabbed the porch railing. His knuckles went white against the wood. Because nobody in Winterset knew what John Wayne owed him. Not his son in Denver, not his neighbors, not the people who had lived 2 houses down from Earl for 15 years. Whatever had passed between these 2 men had never been spoken aloud, had never made a newspaper, had been kept in a metal strongbox under a hardware store counter and in the private ledger of one of the most famous men alive. And the man holding that worn piece of paper had just driven 2 hours from Des Moines to settle it. Stay with us. This story starts in 1957 on a frozen road 17 miles outside this town, and you are not going to believe where it ends. To understand what John Wayne owed Earl Sutton, you have to understand who Earl Sutton was. Not the old man on the porch with the trembling hand, the man underneath that, the man before the small days. Earl was born in 1903 in Madison County, Iowa, the second son of a farmer who fixed his neighbor's fences without being asked and never once mentioned it afterward. That was the household Earl grew up in. Decency without announcement. Duty without theater. When World War II came, Earl enlisted at 38 years old, older than most, steadier than all of them. He served in the Pacific. He came home in 1945 with a quietness about him that Dorothy, his wife, recognized immediately as the kind that doesn't leave. She married it anyway. She married him anyway. That told you everything about Dorothy. Earl re-enlisted when Korea called in 1950. He served at Incheon. He came back in 1951 with a Purple Heart, a slight tremor in his left hand he never explained to anyone, and the same deep quiet, only heavier now. Dorothy didn't ask. She just made sure the coffee was ready when he sat down each morning, and she let the silence be what it needed to be. They settled in Winterset. Earl bought a small hardware store on Marion Street and ran it the way he ran everything. 6 days a week, no complaints, doors open at 7. Dorothy worked the Saturday counter. She had handwriting like a school teacher and remembered every customer's name. Their son Robert was born in 1952. Earl coached his Little League team, He fixed things for people without being asked, and he never kept score. He was not famous. He was not rich. He was not the kind of man whose name traveled far. He was the kind of man whose name stayed close, the kind that a whole town leans on without realizing it until the leaning stops. In February 1957, Earl Sutton drove his truck down a frozen county road outside of Winterset and saw a car stopped on the shoulder in 11-degree weather. He didn't think twice. He pulled over. The car had been there a while. You could tell by the way the exhaust had stopped. The engine was dead, not just idling. A 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air, dark blue, pulled halfway onto the gravel shoulder with one tire sitting in the frozen ditch. The temperature that morning was 11 degrees. The wind off the open Iowa fields made it feel like less. There was no farmhouse visible in either direction. The nearest phone was 8 miles east. Earl pulled his truck up behind the car and got out without hurrying. That was the thing about Earl. He didn't perform concern. He just moved toward whatever needed moving toward. The man inside was in his mid-40s, well-dressed for a county road, a wool overcoat and leather gloves that were doing nothing for him now because the car had been cold for at least an hour. His name was Gerald Hobbs. He was a location coordinator working on a production connected to John Wayne's film company, scouting rural routes near the Iowa border. He had driven out alone that morning and made a mistake that the cold was now charging interest on. Earl got him into the truck cab without a lot of conversation. He turned the heat up. He drove the 17 miles into Winterset. He sat with Gerald Hobbs at the counter of a diner on Madison Street for 3 hours while a mechanic went out to recover the Bel Air. He bought the coffee. When Gerald reached for his wallet at the end, Earl shook his head once, the kind of no that doesn't require words. And that was the end of it. Gerald Hobbs tried to get Earl's address before he left. Earl told him it wasn't necessary. Gerald wrote it down from the phone book anyway. That night, back in his motel room in Des Moines, Gerald Hobbs wrote out everything that had happened. Every detail. The truck pulling over, the silence, the coffee, the refused wallet. And the next morning he sat down across from John Wayne and read it out loud, word for word. Wayne didn't speak for almost a full minute. What Wayne did next, nobody saw coming. Keep watching. John Wayne was not a man who expressed himself easily. The people who worked with him knew that. Directors knew that. Co-stars who had spent months on location with him knew that the version of Wayne the public saw, big, certain, unshakable, was also the version he showed the people closest to him. He did not reach for sentiment. He did not explain himself. But the people who knew him best also knew something else. They knew he kept a ledger. Not written anywhere, not spoken aloud, a private accounting of what was owed and to whom. And when Wayne decided a debt was real, he did not let it expire. The morning after Gerald Hobbs told him about the frozen road, Wayne sat down and wrote a letter. 2 pages, handwritten, plain white stationery. He addressed it to Earl Sutton, Marion Street, Winterset, Iowa. He told Earl what Hobbs had described. He told him that a man who pulls over on a frozen road for a stranger he has never met and refuses payment afterward is exactly the kind of American he had spent his entire career trying to put on screen, and had never quite managed because men like that don't perform it. They just do it. He said he meant to do something about it one day. He signed it with his full name. Earl received the letter in March 1957. He read it once, standing at the hardware store counter before the doors opened. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases, put it inside the metal strongbox he kept under the counter, and locked it. He did not tell Dorothy. He did not tell Robert. When customers asked, and eventually they all asked, whether he had ever met John Wayne, given Winterset's connection to the man, Earl would smile and say, "Not exactly." It was the most elaborate thing Earl Sutton ever said that wasn't true. He kept that letter for 14 years, and on a cold November morning in 1971, John Wayne arrived on his porch holding a copy of it, worn at the creases, opened and closed too many times, to tell Earl something that had not fit inside 2 pages of plain white stationery. What Wayne said at that kitchen table, it was not what anyone would have expected. "Don't go anywhere." Earl opened the door wider without a word. That was invitation enough. Wayne came up the steps. The old porch boards groaned once under his weight, and stepped inside the small house for the first time. Earl led him to the kitchen. He put the kettle on. He set 2 cups on the table the way Dorothy used to, handles facing out. No saucers, because this was not that kind of house. Wayne sat down. He placed the folded letter on the table between them and left it there. They were quiet for a moment, the way men of that generation are quiet. Not awkwardly, but purposefully, the way you settle into something before you say it. Then Wayne spoke. And what he said had nothing to do with the frozen road. He talked about the war, not Korea, not any film. He talked about 1943, when a draft deferment had kept him in Hollywood while men Earl's age shipped out to the Pacific. He had requested active duty twice. Both times the studio intervened. Both times the paperwork buried him. He had spent the rest of his life playing soldiers and cowboys and men of absolute conviction on screen, and he had done it carrying the private knowledge that when the real moment came, he had not been there. He had never said this publicly. He had never said it to a journalist, a director, a co-star, or a friend. He said it now, at Earl Sutton's kitchen table in Winterset, Iowa, with 2 cups of coffee between them and no cameras anywhere. When he finished, his voice was not entirely steady. Earl sat with it for a long time. Then he got up, refilled both cups, sat back down, and said the only thing that was true. He told Wayne that he hadn't stopped on that road in 1957 because of anything noble. He stopped because his father had told him once, one time only, in passing, that a man on a cold road is never a stranger. That was all. Wayne looked at him across the table. "That's exactly what I mean," he said. What Wayne left on that table before he walked out the door changed Earl Sutton's life. Stay with us. Before he stood up from that kitchen table, John Wayne reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope beside the coffee cups. He did not explain it. He did not make a moment of it. He set it down the way a man sets down something he has been carrying too long and is relieved to finally put somewhere permanent. Then he pushed back his chair and stood. Earl looked at the envelope, but did not touch it while Wayne was still in the room. That was Earl. He would not open a thing in front of the man who gave it, because opening it would make it a transaction, and Earl Sutton had spent his entire life making sure his decency was never a transaction. Wayne shook his hand at the door. It was a long handshake, the kind that is really a conversation, the kind where both men are saying something they do not have the words for, and both men know it. Then Wayne walked back down the cracked concrete path to the black car, got in, and was gone. Earl stood in the doorway until the car turned the corner. Then he went back to the kitchen table and sat down alone. Inside the envelope were 2 things. The first was a check. The amount was never made public, but Robert Sutton would say years later that it was enough to repair the house completely, cover every job Earl had been putting off since Dorothy died, and leave a remainder that sat quietly in a savings account through the final years of Earl's life. The second thing was a photograph, 8 by 10, black and white. Wayne on a film set in the early 1940s, signed across the bottom in blue ink. The inscription was not written to a fan. It was specific, deliberate, the kind of words you choose when you mean every single one of them. To Earl Sutton, who showed me what it looks like. J.W. Earl read it once. He set it down on the table. He looked out the kitchen window at the yard Dorothy used to tend, at the flower beds that had gone unplanted for 3 years, at the November sky sitting low and gray over Winterset. Then he picked up the phone and called his son in Denver. It was not Christmas. It was not Robert's birthday. It was a Tuesday in November, and Earl Sutton never called on a Tuesday for no reason. So when Robert heard his father's voice on the line, steady, unhurried, the same voice that had coached Little League and fixed fences and refused payment on a frozen road, he knew something had shifted. He just didn't know what yet. Earl told him everything. The road in 1957, the letter, the 14 years of silence, the black car that morning, the kitchen table, the 2 cups of coffee, and the thing John Wayne had said that no journalist had ever heard and no camera had ever recorded. Robert listened without interrupting. When Earl finished, there was a long quiet on the line between Winterset and Denver. Then Robert said he was coming home. He drove in that weekend. It was the first time he had been back in 4 years. He slept in his old room. He sat with his father on the porch in the cold, the way they used to before distance made it easy not to. They didn't talk about Wayne again. They didn't need to. Something had been restored that had nothing to do with a famous man or a frozen road or a check in an envelope. Something between a father and a son that had been quietly fraying for years had been just as quietly mended. The photograph went up on the kitchen wall beside the window. Visitors who came over the years assumed it was a standard publicity piece. Wayne was Winterset's famous son, after all. Nobody read the inscription closely enough to understand what it meant. Earl never explained it. That was exactly how he wanted it. Earl Sutton died in March 1984. He was buried in Winterset beside Dorothy. Robert gave the eulogy and told the full story publicly for the first time, standing at the graveside in front of 40 people who had known Earl for decades and had no idea. John Wayne had been dead for 5 years by then, but Robert said it anyway, looking down at the casket in the cold March morning air. John Wayne knew who my father was before the rest of us understood it. That is what one decent act looks like from a distance. You never see the full shape of it while you are living it. You only see the frozen road. You only see the man who needs help. Earl Sutton stopped. And 30 years later, 40 people stood in a cemetery in Iowa and finally understood why that mattered. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe, turn the bell on, and tell us in the comments who in your life deserves a knock on their door.